Dubrow Suspicion Files.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're opening a file that's really something else. It's right at this crossroads of amazing technological achievement, but also, well, profound moral questions, maybe even horror.
And bureaucratic maneuvering, too. Cynical maneuvering, you could say.
Right. We're investigating the price of victory, really. This is the story of how the United States, right after World War II, made what, a lot of people have called the ultimate deal with the devil, all to win the next war.
The Cold War. We're launching a full investigation into Operation Paperclip. It was a secret U.S. intelligence program running officially from about 1945 to 1959.
And the scale. It's important to grasp this right away, isn't it?
Absolutely. To understand the moral trade-off here, you have to see the scope. This wasn't some small covert thing affecting a handful of people.
Yeah.
Paperclip brought over 1,600 German and Austrian scientists, engineers, technicians. I mean, these were people core to the Nazi war machine, plus their families, brought them all to the U.S. for government jobs, sensitive government jobs.
1,600. That's a staggering number. But what's really fascinating and maybe easy to miss is the name itself, Paperclip. Our source materials point out that the name itself is like a piece of evidence.
It really is. It's almost a confession hidden in plain sight.
How so?
Well, it started in 45 as Project Overcast. Sounds pretty bland, right? Bureaucratic.
Yeah, nondescript.
But the name changed to Paperclip because the program quickly went beyond just recruiting useful scientists. It started including people with, well, let's call them problematic pasts, as the source has delicately put it.
And problematic past is a massive understatement here, isn't it? We're talking documented ties to the Nazi Party, the SS.
And in many cases, direct involvement in war crimes, especially around the use of slave labor. Horrific stuff.
So how does a paperclip come in?
Okay, so to get these guys who are seen as absolutely essential for national security, despite their pasts, pass the rules, the immigration laws that should have barred them, agents of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, they needed a workaround. And their solution was incredibly low-tech, almost mundane.
What did they do?
They literally took the scientists' new, clean, sanitized immigration papers and attached them with a standard office paperclip right on top of their old incriminating Nazi files. The dossiers detailing their affiliations, their actions.
Wait, seriously? With an actual paperclip?
That's the origin of the name. A paperclip physically hiding the evidence of war crimes underneath the fresh identity card. It's actually bleaching the record so they could get federal approval to come into the country.
That is an unbelievable level of bureaucratic cynicism. Just clip the bad part away.
It's the program's whole method summed up in its name, isn't it? Hiding the ugly past under a clean new identity, all for the sake of technological gain. The government knew what it was doing. They literally pinned the evidence together.
So, okay, this sets up the central conflict for this deep dive, the question we really need to wrestle with for you, the listener. Was Operation Paperclip this pragmatic, maybe even necessary evil? An act of national security done efficiently, ruthlessly because of the new threat, the Soviet Union?
Or was it a profound, maybe even foundational moral compromise? A genuine deal with the devil that deliberately put men involved in atrocities right into the core of the U.S. military, its intelligence agencies, its space program, right as they were being built.
And we should be clear up front, this isn't easy to untangle.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
We need to acknowledge the difficulty rating here. The fact that Operation Paperclip happened, that's Tier 1, documented history. We know the program existed, the dates, the general numbers, many key names.
Yeah.
But the full extent of the moral compromises, the specific actions of all those recruits, and, crucially, where the line falls between official sanction policy from the top and maybe outright internal conspiracy or willful blindness, that's been deliberately blurred.
Intentional blurred, that's key.
Yeah. We're dealing with, 70-plus years of classified files, documents that were known to be altered, that official bleaching we mentioned, and just a general pervasive atmosphere of state-sponsored secrecy. So we have to proceed carefully, step by step.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this. Stage 1, the conspiracy indictment. Where do we start?
We need to begin by looking at the narrative that's often put forward, especially by investigative journalists, by theorists. It's usually the most compelling story. It feels internally consistent, makes a kind of dark, emotional sense.
Right, the story that really grabs you. And the claims are pretty specific, aren't they? Suggesting something deeper than just hiring scientists.
Exactly. Claim number 1 is often called the infiltration hypothesis. The core idea isn't just that the U.S. got help from former Nazis. It's that key U.S. programs, especially in intelligence and space, were actively co-founded by them. At the very top.
Co-founded. That's a strong claim. What's the evidence cited?
Well, Exhibit A, and this is right in our Tier 1 file, totally documented, Wernher von Braun.
The rocket guy?
The rocket guy. But not just any engineer. He was a documented SS officer. And not just a member. He held a significant rank, Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major.
An SS major. And what did the U.S. do with this SS major?
He became the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, the massive rocket that took Apollo missions to the moon.
Okay, huge role.
But even more than that, he was appointed the very first director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama.
The first director.
The first. So you have a high-ranking former SS officer put in charge of arguably the most important civilian space engineering center in the country, right at its inception. That's fuel for the infiltration argument right there.
Yeah, that's pretty stark. Was he the only one?
Not at all. Exhibit B, Kurt Davis, another key V2 rocket scientist from von Braun's Payneman team.
Okay.
Declassified CIA files, these are available now. They explicitly describe Davis as an ardent Nazi.
Ardent Nazi. That's the CIA's own description.
Yep. And what happens to him? He becomes the first director of NASA's Launch Operations Center at Cape Canaveral.
So, wait. Von Braun designs the rocket at Marshall. And Davis, the ardent Nazi, is in charge of actually launching it from the Cape.
Precisely. That's the logical chain that the infiltration theorists really hammer on. The two most critical roles designing the vehicle, launching the vehicle, held by former high-ranking Nazi Party members or affiliates.
The inference being?
The inference drawn is that the very foundation, the DNA, of America's crowning technological achievement, the Apollo program, was fundamentally built by, or at least co-opted by, individuals deeply tied to the Nazi regime. It looks like infiltration from the top down.
Okay. And what about the intelligence connections?
That's another key part of this indictment. Historians consistently point out, and declassified files confirm, direct links between Operation Paperclip recruits and the CIA's earliest programs, the very beginnings of the agency.
So, Paperclip scientists were involved with the CIA right from the start.
Yes. And those connections, as one source notes, have fueled conspiracy theories regarding CIA corruption, espionage, and government smokescreens for decades.
I can see why. If the CIA's first big act was essentially laundering Nazi scientists.
Then the argument goes, how can you trust the foundational integrity of the entire intelligence apparatus? It suggests a kind of original sin right at the heart of U.S. intelligence.
Okay, that's the infiltration claim. What's the second big one?
This one's maybe even more chilling. It's the methodology transfer hypothesis.
Methodology transfer. What does that mean?
The idea here is that these scientists didn't just bring rocket schematics or chemical formulas. They brought their methods, specifically their expertise in, and perhaps tolerance for, unethical human experimentation.
Okay, that's a heavy charge, linking Nazi experiments to U.S. programs.
Directly. The hypothesis rests on connecting two sets of documented facts. First, the Nazi precedent. We know from the Nuremberg doctors' trial about the absolutely horrific human experiments in concentration camps like Dachau.
Yeah, the freezing experiments, the altitude tests, unspeakable things. Freezing prisoners to death in ice water, simulating high-altitude conditions in low-pressure chambers until they died agonizingly. All supposedly for research on pilot survival, but treating human beings as completely disposable material. That's Tier 1 documented horror.
Okay, so that's the Nazi precedent. What's the other side of the claimed link?
The U.S. continuation. Decades later, we have documented evidence, again, Tier 1, of America's own deeply unethical programs. Think Project MKUltra.
The CIA mind control stuff.
Exactly, starting in 1953. And the Edgewood arsenal experiments, run by the U.S. Army from 55 to 75.
What happened there?
They tested psychoactive drugs, LSD, potent incapacitants like BZ, even nerve agents like sarin, on over 700 U.S. soldiers, often without full consent or knowledge of the risks.
Okay, so horrific Nazi experiments and later horrific U.S. experiments.
Yeah.
How does Paperclip supposedly connect them?
The claim is that Paperclip is the direct causal bridge. It's the mechanism that transferred not just the knowledge, but the willingness to conduct such experiments.
And is there specific evidence cited for this bridge?
The key piece of, well, circumstantial evidence used here is the case of Dr. Hubertus Strauchold.
Strauchold, I've heard that name. He was celebrated, wasn't he? Like the father of American space medicine.
That's him, showered with honors in the U.S. But during the war, Strauchold was the director of the Luftwaffe's Institute for Aviation Medicine in Berlin.
Okay.
And here's the crucial link. His direct subordinates, people working under him at that institute, were later tried and convicted at the Nuremberg trials.
Oh.
For the direct participation in those exact Dachau high-altitude and freezing experiments.
So his team members were convicted war criminals for doing those experiments.
Yes. But Struckhold himself, never charged, never tried. He came to the U.S. via Paperclip.
So the argument is A, Dachau experiments, plus B, Struckhold, whose subordinates did A, is brought to the U.S., equals C, later U.S. experiments like Edgewood 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏.
That's the clean, terrifying syllogism presented. Paperclip is painted as the pipeline that imported not just rocket scientists, but the architects, or at least the overseers, of institutionalized human torture, who then influenced or enabled similar work in the U.S.
Wow.
And further investigative accounts point to declassified files, showing the CIA actually working with ex-Nazi doctors, specifically at places like Camp King, a U.S. facility in Germany after the war.
Doing what?
Debriefing them. Picking their brains about interrogation techniques, about truth serums, like mescaline, which the Nazis had experimented with extensively on prisoners.
So leveraging Nazi expertise in coercion and drugs.
Exactly. And the assertion is that this work, this direct consultation, flowed right into the planning and methodology of Project MKUltra. It creates this seamless, devastating narrative. The U.S. didn't just hire rocket scientists. It hired Nazi expertise in controlling and breaking human beings.
Okay, so as a listener hearing all this, von Braun and Davis at NASA, Struckhold connecting Dachau to space medicine, CIA using Nazi interrogation know-how. It really does seem to fit together perfectly, almost too perfectly.
And that feeling is important to notice. This is where we need to pause and think about how our brains work, how we process information.
What do you mean?
Well, this cognitive tendency you might be feeling right now, the urge to see these clean connections, these causal patterns in data points that might actually be separate or only loosely related, that's a known phenomenon. Psychologists call it patternicity, or sometimes apophenia.
Patternicity. So our brains are wired to see patterns, even where maybe there isn't one.
Exactly. We see fact 1. Von Braun worked for the SS. We see fact 2. Von Braun was director at NASA Marshall. Our brain wants to connect them into a simple causal story. A Nazi infiltrated and ran NASA. It's a neat pattern.
It is a neat story. Simple. Evil entity gets inside the good entity.
Precisely. The evidence used to build this specific narrative is often highly selective, cherry-picked even. But the resulting story is clean, it's consistent internally, and it's morally very straightforward. Good versus evil, easy to grasp.
And that pull, that feeling of, wow, this all fits, it must be true, that's confirmation bias, right?
That's very likely playing a role, yes. Confirmation bias is our tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs or hypotheses. If you already suspect government secrecy or find the idea of Nazi influence compelling, this pattern fits right into that. It feels right, emotionally.
It feels more satisfying than just messiness.
Often, yes. The clean narrative of infiltration, where the government is maybe a victim of deception, can feel more comfortable than a messier truth. We have to be aware of that emotional pull. It's a natural psychological hurdle we need to overcome with verification.
Okay, so we've laid out the conspiracy indictment, the patterns people see. Now we need to test it.
Exactly. We have to hold that emotional pull in check and move to stage 2. We need to introduce the crucial element that the infiltration hypothesis usually ignores or downplays, the geopolitical timeline. Specifically, the explosive context of 1945.
The timeline, how does that challenge the infiltration idea?
Because it reveals a fatal flaw in the logic. Let's look at the program's stated objective and how it shifted violently. Project Overcast, the original name, was set up in July 1945. What was its official, temporary goal?
You said earlier to help defeat Japan. Use German tech, mostly rockets, to speed up the end of the war in the Pacific.
Right, a temporary war-ending goal. But here's the critical contradiction. This is Tier 1, documented fact. When did the war against Japan end?
August 1945, VJ Day, very suddenly after the atomic bomb.
Exactly, suddenly. So if the program's mission was to defeat Japan, what should have happened in August or September 1945?
It should have wound down, right? Or stopped completely. Mission accomplished.
That's the logical expectation. But instead, the program accelerated. It got bigger. It moved from being just a temporary Army project to getting formal, high-level approval directly from President Truman in September 1946, becoming Operation Paperclip.
So the war ends, and the program to end the war ramps up. That makes no sense unless the goal changed.
Precisely. Why did a war-ending program accelerate after the war was over? The answer is immediate, it's decisive, and it's right there in the declassified records.
What was the new goal?
The U.S. wasn't thinking about the Axis anymore. They were already preparing to fight the Soviet Union.
The Cold War. Already.
Immediately. The goal shifted violently. It went from tactical war ending to securing long-term advantages in what military planners instantly saw as a new kind of conflict. They called it a wizard war. A war fought with advanced technology, intelligence, scientific superiority.
A wizard war. Okay, so the goal wasn't about liking Nazis?
Not at all. The primary goal became something far more cynical and strategic.
Denial.
Denial.
Meaning
ensuring that this specific, finite, absolutely irreplaceable pool of German scientific talent, which represented maybe a 2-decade head start in crucial areas like rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical weapons, did not fall into Soviet hands. It was about grabbing these assets before the other side could.
So it's a resource grab, kept the wizards away from the Soviets.
Exactly. That's the first major crack in the idea of an ideological infiltration. The motive wasn't pro-Nazi alignment. It was purely pragmatic, brutally geopolitical. It was an immediate zero-sum anti-Soviet acquisition policy. Get them before Moscow does.
And was this fear real? Were the Soviets actually trying to get these same scientists?
Oh, absolutely. The commanders on the ground in Germany were sending panicked reports back. They confirmed the British were recruiting, the French were recruiting, and critically, the Soviets were aggressively recruiting these exact same scientists and technicians.
So it wasn't just paranoia, it was a race.
It was absolutely a race. The U.S. didn't see it as a choice between being ethical or compromising. They saw it as a choice between getting these scientists or letting the Soviets get them, potentially allowing Moscow to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at the U.S. much faster.
So the weapon they were acquiring wasn't just V-2 rockets.
No, the real weapon was the knowledge in the scientists' heads, the expertise. That's what the U.S. was determined to secure and denied to the enemy. The motive wasn't ideological protection of Nazis, it was the acquisition of their intellectual capital.
Okay, so it was a race, and you can verify this by looking at what the Soviets are doing.
Yes, comparing Paperclip to the Soviet equivalent program really highlights the U.S. approach as pragmatic, even if morally dubious. The Soviet program was called Operation 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏.
Operation 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, how did it compare?
Well, let's break it down, because the differences in scale and especially method are huge, and they tell you a lot about the goals and the outcomes.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Scale. Paperclip, as we said, over 1,600 specialists plus families. 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏. Even bigger in raw numbers. Over 2,500 specialists, which totaled over 6,000 people, including their families.
Wow, so the Soviets actually grabbed more people initially.
They did, but the method was completely different. And this is crucial for understanding why Paperclip, despite its moral baggage, was arguably more effective in the long run.
How so? What was the U.S. method versus the Soviet method?
Paperclip was based on recruitment. Implicitly, it involved consent, at least on some level. Scientists like von Braun chose to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. They were offered contracts, money, the prospect of U.S. citizenship, a chance to continue their work. Legally, they were treated as employees eventually.
Okay, recruitment. What about the Soviets?
𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 was based on abduction, coercion. The sources are clear. Specialists and their families were rounded up, often drafted at gunpoint, given just hours' notice. On one single night, October 22, 1946, they were loaded onto 92 freight trains and shipped thousands of miles east into the Soviet interior.
92 trains in one night. That's an operation.
It was massive, and it wasn't a negotiation. It was forced relocation on an industrial scale.
And how were they treated once they got there?
That reflects the method. Paperclip led to integration. The German scientists became colleagues eventually. They were given labs, resources, promoted to senior positions, directors like von Braun and Davis within the U.S. military and NASA structure. They were expected to lead, to teach, to innovate within the American system.
Integrated into the system.
And the Soviet approach.
Isolation. The German scientists in the USSR were treated essentially as valuable prisoners. They were confined to specialized, closed facilities like Gordomnia Island. They were forced to work, rebuild the V-2, teach Soviet engineers, yes. But they were kept strictly segregated from the mainstream Soviet science establishment and leadership. They weren't integrated.
So what was the long-term result of these different approaches? Paperclip, for all its moral compromises, led to long-term compounding success for the U.S. You get the Redstone missile, the Jupiter, eventually the Saturn V. The German expertise was integrated and allowed to evolve and lead.
And 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏.
It gave the Soviets crucial short-term gains. They absolutely benefited and jump-started their own missile program, leading to the R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik. But historians generally argue it was less successful in the long run because that policy of isolation limited the Germans' impact. They couldn't fully integrate, mentor the next generation broadly, or influence the overall direction of Soviet rocketry in the same way von Braun's team did in the U.S. Their value was extracted, then they were sidelined.
So the U.S. method, while cynical, was ultimately more effective at leveraging the long-term intellectual capital.
Arguably, yes.
Yep.
It was a more effective form of transactional exploitation, you could say.
Okay, so the motive was pragmatic acquisition. The method was integration. What was the actual payoff? The cui bono who benefits? Was the benefit to the U.S. really that big?
Oh, immensely so. Demonstrably huge. This is Tier 1 again. The technological leap was immediate, especially in rocketry.
We talked about the Saturn V lineage.
Exactly. The V2 technology they brought over was the direct ancestor of the Army's Redstone missile. The Redstone was then the foundation for the Jupiter missile, which then directly informed the Saturn I and ultimately the Saturn V that got us to the moon. It's not just inspired by, it's a direct, traceable engineering line. Von Braun's team literally designed these subsequent rockets.
Can we break down that $10 billion estimated value? What specific tech represented that kind of advantage?
Sure. Think about guidance systems. The V2 had, for its time, revolutionary inertial guidance, gyroscopes, and accelerometers that let the missile track its own position without external radio commands, which could be jammed. Paperclip scientists brought that know-how, which was way ahead of U.S. efforts. That became critical for accurate ballistic missiles.
Okay, guidance. What else?
Advanced propellant chemistry. They had deep experience with powerful liquid fuels, including hypergolic fuel stuff that ignites on contact, making engines simpler and more reliable. That was vital for early U.S. missile stages. Also, aerodynamics for supersonic flight, large-scale rocket engine design, manufacturing techniques for complex aerospace components.
So it wasn't just the V2 blueprints, it was the whole ecosystem of knowledge, decades of trial and error.
Precisely. It was the immediate transfer of 2 decades of cutting-edge research, development, and practical experience that the U.S. would have otherwise spent years, maybe decades, and billions of dollars trying to replicate from scratch.
And it wasn't just rockets, right?
No, the impact was much broader. Paperclip scientists were pivotal in developing advanced jet engines. The Germans were way ahead in jet propulsion at the end of the war. Also, significant contributions to radar technology, electronic surveillance methods, even foundational strategic thinking for chemical and nuclear defense. The documented value, just in terms of patents filed and industrial processes transferred, has been estimated by researchers, as you said, at around $10 billion in then dollars, which is enormous.
So looking at the context, the Soviet race, the denial motive, the integration method, and this huge tangible technological payoff, it seems to really undermine that idea of ideological infiltration, doesn't it?
Completely. The motive driving Paperclip wasn't ideological sympathy. It was demonstrably, ruthlessly utilitarian. It was about acquiring tools, intellectual tools to win the Cold War.
That seems to be the key finding from Stage 2. It frames Paperclip as this pragmatic, maybe necessary evil in the face of what was seen as an existential threat.
Yes, and understanding the pragmatic context is essential for Stage 3. The decisive rebuttal. Now, we use this evidence of geopolitical pragmatism to go back and re-examine those original conspiracy claims, and, more importantly, to understand the real nature of the government's deception. The argument shifts here. It stops being, were these guys Nazis? Because, yes, many were. The real question becomes, did the U.S. government knowingly facilitate this cover-up at the highest levels?
Okay, so rebuttal number 1. Back to the infiltration claim.
Right. The Tier 1 evidence shows that claim is just false. It wasn't a hostile infiltration against the state where sneaky Nazis tricked their way in.
It was the opposite.
It was sanctioned, official, top-down recruitment by the state. The state wasn't the victim. It was the perpetrator of the process.
And you mentioned earlier this is actually more disturbing than the conspiracy.
I think so, yeah. The conspiracy theory that the government was fooled by a few bad apples is almost comforting. It lets you believe the system itself is fundamentally good, just temporarily compromised.
But the truth is,
the declassified facts show the U.S. government, as an institution, was the one doing the deceiving. It wasn't just a few rogue agents in the JIOA. The Joint Chiefs of Staff knew. The Army, the Navy, the State Department, they were all involved, all complicit in the process of bringing these scientists in, knowing about their pasts. They weren't tricked by the scientists. They knowingly engineered the cover-up of those pasts.
Which leads straight into rebuttal 2. The claim that this was maybe some deep state rogue agency, the JIOA, acting alone.
Yeah, the idea that maybe the JIOA was hiding this from the top leadership, the internal evidence shows that's also not quite right. The JIOA wasn't hiding its actions from the president. It was actively disobeying him.
Disobeying the president. How?
President Harry Truman. He personally issued a very explicit order. This is Tier 1 documented evidence. He banned ardent Nazis, or anyone found to have been an active supporter of the Nazi regime, from participating in Operation Paperclip. He drew a clear moral line.
He said no hardcore Nazis.
Essentially, yes. He specifically stated, these individuals must not be brought to the U.S. He tried to impose an ethical boundary.
And the military intelligence community's response to this direct presidential order?
They circumvented it.
Yeah.
Systematically.
Yeah.
The JIOA, military intelligence, they engaged in what the internal documents themselves called the bleaching.
The bleaching, that's the term they used.
Yes. It meant systematically altering the personnel files, removing incriminating evidence like SS membership records, reports of overseeing slave labor at places like Middlework. They doctored the file specifically to get these high-value scientists past the State Department vetting process, which was supposed to enforce Truman's order.
So they weren't just bending the rules, they were actively breaking a direct order from the commander-in-chief to gain a competitive edge. That's audacious.
It's incredibly audacious, and it wasn't hidden. There's a smoking gun document that lays bare the entire cynical rationale.
What is it?
It's a memo from March 1948. Written by Captain Bosket Webb, who was the director of the JIOA at the time, arguing to the State Department about the vetting process.
And what did Captain Webb argue in this memo?
He argued, bluntly, against continuing to make Nazi affiliations a significant barrier for paperclip recruits. He literally wrote that continuing to treat past Nazism as a major issue was, quote, beating a dead Nazi horse.
Beating a dead Nazi horse. Wow.
Yeah. And he went on to state explicitly that the far greater threat of communism was the only priority that mattered anymore. He wasn't saying Nazism wasn't bad. He was saying it was irrelevant compared to the Cold War imperative.
That phrase, beating a dead Nazi horse, it's chilling. It confirms the mindset, doesn't it? The intelligence community had already decided politically and morally that World War II is over, the Nazis were yesterday's enemy, and the only thing that mattered now was fighting the Soviets. Any moral compromise from the last war was just paperwork.
Exactly. That memo proves this wasn't a secret conspiracy by ideological infiltrators. It was a cynical, documented, top-down policy choice. Prioritize utility over morality, violate a presidential order if necessary, just get the anti-Soviet assets. The system itself wasn't tricked. The system chose to compromise.
Okay, a documented policy of compromise. Now let's apply that to the third major claim. The idea that paperclip scientists caused or created MKUltra and the Edgewood experiments.
Right, the methodology transfer again. As we touched on, the direct causal link that Paperclip created these programs is a Tier 1 causal error. It's patternicity seeing a link that isn't strictly causal.
Why? Didn't the U.S. learn from them?
The U.S. government didn't need Paperclip scientists to conceive of unethical human experimentation. The main driver for MKUltra starting in '53 was fear. Fear of Soviet and Chinese brainwashing techniques, supposedly used on U.S. POWs during the Korean War. The U.S. wanted its own mind control methods, defensively and offensively.
Okay, so MKUltra had its own origin in Cold War paranoia. What about Edgewood?
Edgewood Arsenal had been involved in U.S. Army chemical weapons research since 1922. Testing chemicals on soldiers, sadly, wasn't entirely new. The large-scale experiments from 1955 onward were an escalation. Driven by the Cold War, need to understand and counter potential Soviet chemical and biological attacks and develop new incapacitating agents.
So the idea that Paperclip started these programs is historically wrong. The U.S. government had the motive and the means already.
Correct. They had the will, the funding, the infrastructure independently. However, and this is the absolutely crucial nuance, the Tier 2 truth that connects them, while Paperclip scientists did not create these programs, they were brought in as expert consultants. And they definitely accelerated these programs.
Accelerated how? By providing what?
By providing specific, hands-on, often gruesome, real-world experience that the American researchers lacked.
Experience gained through?
Often through the unethical, even lethal, experiments conducted under the Nazi regime. For example, investigative journalist Linda Hunt uncovered documents showing at least 8 key Paperclip scientists worked directly at Edgewood Arsenal.
Where they were testing sarin and LSD on U.S. soldiers.
Exactly. These German specialists brought detailed knowledge about how the human body reacts to extreme chemical stress, to nerve agents, to psychoactive compounds. Knowledge often gleaned from experiments the U.S. couldn't or wouldn't conduct on that scale itself.
Can you give a more specific example of that kind of knowledge transfer?
Think about Dr. Strughold again, the father of space medicine. His institute in Berlin had conducted those horrific high-altitude and freezing experiments at Dachau. That generated specific, if blood-soaked, data on human physiological limits, hypothermia, oxygen deprivation. When the U.S. Air Force needed to develop better pilot survival gear, better ejection seats, protocols for high-altitude flight,
They turned to Strughold and his associates.
they consulted that expertise. Similarly, we mentioned the CIA debriefing Nazi doctors at Camp King. They weren't just asking about abstract interrogation theory. They were asking about practical application, how much mescaline causes disorientation. What are the physiological effects? They were tapping into the Nazis' vast, ethically unconstrained human experimentation database.
So the finding here isn't the simple conspiracy story Nazis infiltrated and created dark U.S. programs.
No. The finding is arguably much darker about the U.S. government itself. The U.S. already had the will and the infrastructure for unethical research, driven by Cold War fear. Operation Paperclip provided the specific, highly experienced personnel and the data, the fuel, to make those programs run much faster and perhaps more effectively, instantly giving them access to decades of forbidden knowledge.
They didn't start the fire, but they showed up with expert advice on how to make it burn hotter and faster.
That's a good way to put it. It's a fundamentally different conclusion about American choices and ethics during that era.
Okay, we've moved from the conspiracy theory through the reality of this cynical policy. Now, stage 4. We have to address this paradox. If the documented policy is actually more damning in some ways, why do the distorted conspiracy theories persist so strongly?
That's a great question. And then after that, we absolutely have to confront the unavoidable moral weight, the honest residue, the actual documented crimes of the specific men the U.S. government recruited and protected.
Right. Let's start with why the simpler, maybe less accurate theories stick around. Cognitive biases again.
Definitely. The first one that's really relevant here is called proportionality bias.
Proportionality bias.
Yeah, it's our tendency as humans to assume that big, momentous events must have equally big, momentous causes. Think about something huge, like the Apollo moon landing or winning the Cold War.
Massive achievements.
Our brains don't easily accept that such enormous outcomes could result from something that feels, well, kind of small or mundane. The factual explanation we've discussed, that the U.S. won the space race partly by hiring amoral technocrats, violating a presidential order, systematically bleaching files, it feels bureaucratic.
Yeah.
It feels cynical, maybe grubby, but not epic. It feels disproportionately small compared to landing on the moon.
It lacks grandeur.
Exactly. But the conspiracy explanation, a vast, secret, ideological infiltration by remnants of the Nazi regime, a hidden evil manipulating events, that feels proportionally satisfying. The cause feels as big and dramatic as the effect. We crave a cause that matches the scale of the outcome. It just makes for a better, more emotionally resonant story.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second bias?
Bias, too, is critical here. It's about distrust and the illusion of control. We've established with Tier 1 evidence that the government was deceptive. The bleaching of files, the violation of Truman's order, those are documented facts.
Right. They lied. Or at least deliberately concealed the truth.
And once an authority is proven deceptive in one significant area, it becomes psychologically much easier to believe they're deceptive in all areas. Even if the subsequent theories become incredibly complex or far-fetched, the initial breach of trust opens the door to wider suspicion.
So the proven cover-up fuels belief in even bigger unproven cover-ups.
Yes. And paradoxically, believing in a conspiracy, even a malevolent one, can offer a strange kind of comfort.
Comfort? How?
The idea that there's a single, secret, all-powerful group pulling the strings, whether it's Nazis or the Illuminati or whoever it provides an illusion of control, it suggests the world isn't random or chaotic, it's controlled, even if by a bad group. For some people, that's less frightening than the alternative.
Which is?
Which is closer to the truth we've uncovered here. That history is often just a messy, decentralized series of pragmatic, sometimes amoral, often contradictory decisions made by different people and agencies pursuing competing goals. That level of chaos and moral ambiguity can be much more unsettling to live with than believing in a single controlling conspiracy.
Okay, so biases help explain why the theories persist. But now we have to set the theories aside and face what you called the honest residue, the documented facts about the men themselves. This is the real weight of the compromise.
This is unavoidable. Let's look again at Werner von Braun. We know he was an SS officer. But what about the slave labor used to build his V2s? Did he know?
What does the evidence say?
Tier 1 evidence confirms he knew intimately. He worked constantly with the SS who ran the camps, supplying the labor for the Mittelwerk underground factory, the place often called Dora Mittelbau. He even admitted it later. In 1969, testifying in a German court case, he admitted under oath he had personally visited Mittelwerk multiple times and had seen the terrible conditions.
Terrible conditions. Knowing what Mittelwerk was like, that feels like a criminal understatement.
It absolutely is. Mittelwerk was hell on earth. A gigantic, dark, damp underground tunnel complex where thousands of prisoners, French resistance fighters, Soviet POWs, political dissidents, Jews were forced to live, work, and die. 16-hour shifts, constant beating, starvation, disease, executions, never seeing daylight for months on end. Just brutal.
And von Braun saw this.
He saw it. And the evidence suggests his involvement was more than just passive observation. There's a memo from August 1944 bearing his signature along with other senior staff. It confirms that von Braun personally traveled to the Buchenwald concentration camp.
Why?
To personally inspect and select prisoners, to pick out skilled inmates to be transferred to Mittelwerk to work on his rocket assembly lines.
He handpicked slave laborers from Buchenwald.
The memo indicates participation in the selection process. Yes, this wasn't distant awareness. This was active, logistical participation in the machinery of slave labor and atrocity.
And the human cost of building his rocket.
It's staggering. More than 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelwerk and its associated subcamps, building the V2. Think about that. The V2 rocket itself, used as a weapon against cities like London and Antwerp, killed about 9,000 civilians.
So more people died building the weapon than were killed by it.
By more than double. Von Braun's technological marvel was literally built on mass death. That's the residue for him.
Okay. What about the other key figures? Arthur Rudolph.
Arthur Rudolph, equally crucial to the U.S. program. He became the project director for the Saturn V rocket itself at NASA Marshall. Hugely important role.
And his wartime record.
Just as damning. He was the chief production engineer at Mittelwerk. There's a memo from him dated April 1943 where he explicitly recommends using concentration camp labor, specifically calling for help from the SS camps to solve production bottlenecks for the V2. He was proactively involved in institutionalizing slave labor for the program.
So direct complicity. And unlike von Braun, Rudolph faced some consequence later, didn't he?
Yes, eventually. And this is maybe the most profound, if incredibly delayed, admission by the U.S. government itself. In 1984, after years of investigation, the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, OSI, concluded its case against Rudolph.
What did they find?
They found overwhelming evidence of his role in the brutal exploitation of slave labor at Mittelwerk, linking him directly to the inhumane conditions. Facing the prospect of a very public trial detailing these war crimes.
What did you do?
He chose to avoid it. Rudolph voluntarily renounced his U.S. citizenship he'd held for decades, after being brought over by Paperclip and agreed to leave the country permanently, returning to Germany.
He gave up his citizenship to avoid trial.
Yes. It wasn't a finding of guilt in court, but it was a clear admission facilitated by the U.S. government itself. Decades after celebrating him as a hero of the space race, the government essentially conceded his complicity in war crimes to avoid the scandal of prosecuting him. That act speaks volumes about the original compromise. They protected him as long as they could, but the evidence became undeniable.
A deeply unsettling resolution. And finally, Dr. Strauchold, the father of space medicine.
Strauchold. As we mentioned, his direct colleagues were convicted at Nuremberg for the Dachau experiments conducted under his institute's purview.
But he was protected.
Declassified files show U.S. military officials actively argued against him, even being questioned too deeply, let alone tried. They stated his scientific value, particularly for aviation and space medicine, was simply too high to risk losing him or having his past exposed in a public trial. He was deemed essential.
So he lived out his life comfortably in the U.S.
He did. He received numerous awards and honors. However, the truth did eventually catch up in a different way.
How so?
As more documentation about the Dachau experiments and his institute's connection to them became public knowledge, particularly through the work of historians and journalists in the later 20th century, the pressure mounted.
There were consequences.
Yes, posthumous, but significant. His name was formally removed from the International Space Hall of Fame in New Mexico, and the Aerospace Medical Library at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, which had been named in his honor, was renamed.
So a public reckoning, even if delayed.
A quiet but clear statement. The establishment eventually had to acknowledge that the honors bestowed upon him were built on a foundation of concealed horror. The record of the moral compromise, though protected for decades by claims of necessity, couldn't ultimately withstand the weight of the historical evidence forever.
Okay. We have, I think, completed a pretty exhaustive deep dive into this file on Operation Paperclip. We've moved past the sort of simple, clean fiction of conspiracy.
And into the much messier, documented reality of deliberate government policy.
And the core conclusion seems unavoidable. The claim that the United States was just a passive victim infiltrated by some secret Nazi cabal that created its darkest programs. That narrative is a fiction. It seems largely driven by our psychological need for simpler stories, for patternicity, for proportionality bias.
Yes. The documented evidence, the Tier 1 memos, the timelines, the internal arguments, they all show something different. They show the United States government at multiple high levels was the active architect of a deliberate, sanctioned policy.
A policy that knowingly violated a presidential order?
Right. A policy that knowingly laundered the files, bleached the records of men understood to be complicit in, and in some cases active participants in, horrific war crimes.
And they did this for one primary reason.
To gain a rapid, decisive technological edge over the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War. It was a calculated trade.
So the conspiracy theory, the secret infiltration, that's the fiction, maybe a comforting one in a strange way.
Well, the moral compromise, the conscious choice by the U.S. government to prioritize perceived national security and technological advantage over fundamental ethics and accountability, that is, the chilling, undeniable fact supported by the evidence.
And even after looking at all this, there's still stuff we don't know, right? There's an unexplained residue.
Absolutely. Many JIOA files, many specific personnel dossiers related to Paperclip, especially for the less famous scientists among the 1600, remain classified even today, almost 80 years later.
So the full scope of the bleaching, the full extent of the compromises made for every single recruit, we might never know the complete story?
That's very possible. There's likely more detail buried in archives, perhaps lost forever.
Which brings us back then to the ultimate unresolved question. The question this deep dive forces you, the listener, to confront based on the evidence we have reviewed.
Was Operation Paperclip, in the final analysis, a pragmatic, maybe even a necessary evil? Was it an unavoidable bargain made in that wizard war against what was seen as a truly existential threat from the Soviet Union? Did preserving national security in that moment absolutely require trading short-term ethics for long-term survival and technological dominance? Was avoiding Soviet missile superiority worth that institutional stain?
Or was it something more fundamental? Was it a foundational moral compromise that set a dangerous new precedent? Did it establish right at the dawn of the Cold War in the modern national security state that national security could and would operate decisively, permanently, above the law, above the explicit moral instructions of the president, and above documented humanitarian crimes whenever deemed necessary by those in power?
We've laid out all the available evidence from the sources, detailing the context, the choices made, the justifications offered, and the undeniable human price that was paid.
Now the judgment is yours.